Read Smart, the Baillie Gifford Prize for Non-Fiction podcast. This podcast is generously supported by the Blavatnik Family Foundation.
Hello, and thank you for joining us for this episode of Read Smart. I'm your host, Razia Iqbal, and I've been talking to each of the shortlisted authors for the Winner of Winners Award. For those of you who haven't been listening recently, the Winner of Winners Award will go to the best of the previous 24 recipients of the prize. The shortlist has been chosen by an illustrious panel of judges chaired by Jason Cowley and featuring Shahida Bari, Sarah Churchwell and Francis Wilson. Now, in this episode, I'll be talking to Wade Davis, anthropologist and writer, about the book that won the 2012 Baillie Gifford Prize for Non-Fiction. It's called Into the Silence, The Great War, Mallory and the Conquest of Everest. Wade joins us now. Thanks so much for speaking with us today, Wade.
Oh, it's a delight to be with you.
So let's go back to the beginning, maybe not of the book, but of you, really, and your background in anthropology. I mean, where did that interest come from? And once you've dealt with that, let's talk about how that fed into the impulse to write this particular book, because you've written so many books.
Well, it's actually a kind of funny, almost embarrassing question. You know, I think people imagine careers unfolding in a linear way when in fact they are often catalyzed by moments of kind of serendipity. I literally spent my first year at university mostly making trouble. And when it came time to determine a major, I hadn't given the slightest thought. And I happened to have come through the Peabody Museum of Ethnology at Harvard for the first time on the very deadline of that decision. And I ran into a mate in the street and I said, "Stuart, what are you going to major in tomorrow?" And he said to me, "Anthropology." And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "Well, you read about Indians." And I, like Forrest Gump, I said, "That'll do." And and I signed on for anthropology. And I think that the cool thing was that I fell into a couple of important mentors, a great plant explorer, Richard Evans Schultes, probably the greatest Amazonian explorer of the 20th century, and the great humanist and activist, in a way, David Maybury Lewis, who had just was about to found Cultural Survival. So I had this sense of academics being an opportunity, in a way, for activism, be it environmental or cultural advocacy on behalf and with Indigenous people. And I never thought of an academic path as being anything more than a lens through which to see the world, and if only for a while. And perhaps that's why I've jumped from whatever subject sort of struck me or ignited my imagination, or just I fell upon, from voodoo and zombies to the Amazon to of course the slopes of Everest. I mean, the genesis of this book, Into the Silence, was again utterly serendipitous. I had traveled in 1996. We basically made something up called the Sino-American Ecological Survey, just to get permits to go to places scientists hadn't gone since the Chinese Revolution. And we were able to travel about 6,000 kilometers overland through southeastern Tibet, eventually to Lhasa and on to Kathmandu. And we passed Everest in the fateful spring where the debacle happened that Krakauer wrote about so powerfully in his book Into Thin Air. And leading our expedition was Dan Taylor, an extraordinary character whose father had been a very good friend of Howard Somerville. And Daniel had been kind of nursed on Everest. And the tragic loss of life for no particular purpose really struck him. And this wasn't the Everest of his imaginings. And the following season, quite by chance, Dan and I returned to the east face of Everest, the legendary Gama Valley, to attempt to photograph both snow leopards and perhaps even clouded leopards if we could get down the gorge of the Arun. And we got trapped in snow, and we almost thought we were going to be in there for the entire winter. And one day when we were standing in the fields at Petanringbo, where Mallory camped, you're standing on ground higher than anything in Europe, and yet you're looking up at 2 vertical miles of ice rising on the Kanchung face to the south col of Everest from the east. And of course, this was the last of the faces to be climbed. It was the one that Mallory took one look at and felt it would never be done. And Daniel, in his inimitable way, began to speak to me about Englishmen dressed in tweeds who read Shakespeare to each other in the snow at 24,000 feet. I was immediately captivated because I was always intrigued as an Anglophile by the character of these charismatic and sometimes crazy Englishmen who flung themselves against the world. And I was also, I think, deeply touched by what had happened in my own family during both those wars. You know, my grandfather was a surgeon at the front all through the First World War. He never came back the same. My own father, something happened to him in London at St. Mary's and in the Home Guard during Hitler's war. He never spoke about it, but I think in some way he too was broken by the experience. I always felt that these men had given up their lives so that I would never have to. And so there was this sort of deep loyalty to those generations, but particularly in my grandfather's generation. And one thing or another just led to this idea I had that I was never interested in whether George Mallory and Sandy Irving got to the top before they met their end. Of course, I was interested, but what really consumed my interest or my passion in a way was what was the character of these men that carried them aloft, and that was the essence of what. And the book, the genesis of the actual book, was simply a letter that I wrote to Peter Matson, my agent. And curiously, that letter ended with the last line that, in fact, would end up in the last line of Into the Silence. A book that would consume 12 years to write and research. And that line was, for this entire generation, life mattered less than the moments of being alive. And that was really the kind of the impetus for the book.
And that quote is from a letter that one of the team of the 3 expeditions that you look at in the book. I'm really interested in the fact that you dedicated the book to your grandfather and that you were interested in the character of these men, because the entire premise of the book is to actually look at the attempts to climb Everest in an era that was directly tied to British imperialism. I wonder how you can just explain that to people who have not read the book.
Yeah, I mean, it's if you think about it, Everest became almost like a Rorschach test of the plight or the fate, or one could say the decline of the British Empire. The effort began before the Great War, when an empire of explorers had famously lost the race for the North and South Poles to others. And so Everest, looming over the Raj, within the clear domain of the British, it became kind of a third pole. And climbing, it became not just a mission of mountaineering, but rather almost a gesture of imperial redemption. And then in the wake of the war, it became, in a sense, a symbol of regeneration for an entire nation bled white by the conflict. And then curiously, in the wake of the death of Mallory in 1924, and for a number of very interesting reasons, the ability to go to Tibet was shut down by the 13th Dalai Lama. And it wasn't until 1933 that the British returned. And 33 was quite an extraordinary expedition, and 3 men got very high, equaling Colonel Norton's height record of 24. But the expeditions that came later in the 30s, I think it was 35, was 36, 38, whatever, were just unmitigated failures. And they became, in a sense, symbols of Britain's impotence on the eve of Hitler's war. And then when finally in 1953, when the mountain was climbed by Sir John Hunt's team, it was powerfully symbolic that those who reached the top were not from Oxbridge, as Arthur Hincks had always anticipated in the early 20s, but rather a humble beekeeper from the far reaches of empire and a Sherpa, Tenzing Norgay. And critically, when Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay refused to say who got to the top first, that single gesture kind of inverted the whole idea of what it meant to be a colony, what it meant to be colonized. And this, of course, was only 6 years after India's independence. And, of course, Nehru seized upon this as a great symbol, which is why he embraced mountaineering with such zeal. So, the climbs really reflected the fate of the empire. And by the same token, when I looked at the expeditions, 26 men went on those 3 expeditions, with some overlap, of course, in 21, 22, and 24. But all the attention had gone on Mallory, and the other characters were kind of treated as sort of support players in some kind of, Greek drama of George Mallory. And the truth is, all 26 of the men who went were stunningly interesting characters. And so one of the things I wanted to do was sort of, give each of them their due, because they were so indescribably interesting. And so one thing I set out to do, and of course, the premise of the book, in a way, never spoken about, I suppose, but never forgotten, was that the Great War really was consequential in both the lives of these men, but also in the spirit with which they went to the mountain.
All but 6 of them had seen action in the war, either as combatants or as medics.
Not just seen action. I mean, they had been wounded several times. John Noel spent the whole year, the whole war, shell-shocked in asylum. I mean, they 3 or 4 of them were surgeons at the casualty clearing stations. Howard Somerville walked out the morning of the Somme, having been told that he might expect 1,000 casualties in a week. And he was one of 2 surgeons looking out at 5 acres of bleeding, dying boys. And he had to decide who would live and who would die. But to make that premise, I couldn't tell people that, because I didn't know. I had to show it. And showing it involved really finding out what these men had experienced. So one of the great challenges was to find out where each of the 20 men, as you mentioned, who had fought. And by the way, the others didn't escape the war, except maybe Beetham as a school teacher. Sandy was too young. Longstaff was too old. And so on. But I looked to find where every single one of those men had been every single day of the 4 years and 4 months of the war, and I was able to do that through the military records. And then the other extraordinary thing is that they may not have described their specific experiences on any one day, but because of the battle records, you could find out what had happened to them on any day because of where they were. And so, one of the things we forget about that war was how small the zone of British operations was. I mean, the British front at no point was longer than 125 miles. For much of the war, it was less than 100 miles. And behind that frontage, the British would build 6,000 miles of railroads, 6,000 miles of trench. And so every single spot in that bloodied field had been covered by regimental journals, by poetry, by letters home. So you could really find out what had happened with a degree of specificity that I wouldn't have imagined possible before the research began.
It is so interesting that your thinking as an anthropologist it made you look at the men and what made them think and what motivated them and what made them want to do this. In some cases, it's extraordinary that any of them survived. They were trying to climb Everest in +4s and wearing tweed. And I mean,
well, they didn't. That's a little bit of a myth. They didn't have modern equipment, but they had the best equipment available, and it was pretty good, except for the boots and except for crampons. Those were the big weakness, and the ropes were weak. But anthropology tries to look beneath the surface of things, and every other. Some very splendid books that had covered these expeditions. It was interesting how, even though written often by very fine British scholars, they treated the war as kind of just a backstory, a one line saying that Norton had fought at the Somme or something, and not really connecting the two, whereas I felt that was so, absolutely essential. And also in terms of, the book is also very much how these expeditions were conceived within the context of the Raj. I mean, these weren't just climbing expeditions. I mean, permission to go to Tibet in 1921 was all part of a complex arms deal worked out between Charles Bell and the 13th Dalai Lama that would be the key, as he saw it, to a free and independent Tibet. And by the same token, the refusal to allow the British to return to Tibet, as they planned to do immediately in the wake of Mallory's death in 1924, was all because of the offense caused by Noel's film, in which the Tibetan authorities were deeply offended that he had sort of, invited, without the permission of the authorities, several monks to come to London to kind of decorate the theater set as the film would play. And that was deeply offensive to the Tibetans. And that's what caused was called the affair of the dancing lamas. And so these things were always enmeshed. And again, I wanted to give voice to the anonymous porters and Sherpas. So, for example, I spent weeks living in monasteries around Everest, because the Lama who met, for example, the expeditions at Rongbuk in 2122 was Zatul Rinpoche. His heir spiritually was Trulsug Rinpoche, who is still alive at the Thupten Sholin Monastery in Nepal. So by being in that monastery, you were effectively in Rongbuk in 1921. And I also, for example, got hold of the spiritual autobiography that Zatul Rinpoche had written, his Namtar, which had never been translated. So I had that translated by monks in Kathmandu to see what they were actually saying live time as the British arrived, So there was a tremendous amount of research into the Tibetan side of the story, and not just in terms of the religious basis, but the metaphysics of landscape. The fact that, this idea that Everest is sacred is a completely false kind of bit of alpine hippie ethnography. The truth is that it's not the mountain that's sacred, but the environs of the mountain, because this is one of the hidden valleys of Kembelun, one of the sanctuaries, carved into space at the dawn of time by Guru Rinpoche. So, it was a metaphysical landscape, also with portals to the divine. So they were walking the whole time, unbeknownst to them, in a landscape of mystic space.
You are really sensitive to the people of Tibet and indeed their religion, and the contrast in language as well between those people of Tibet who, and you alluded to the relationship between Mallory and Tenzing Norgay as well, but, the language of... Hilary and Tenzing Norgay, but also the language in terms of the climbers, the Western climbers, saying that they wanted to assault the mountain and attack the mountain, in a way is so different to the relationship to the environment that the Tibetans had.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that these it's not an accident that we have that language in the mountaineering tradition, because certainly the British mountaineering tradition, of course, it was nursed in the Lake District and in France and Switzerland, the Alps. But in India, in the Raj, it was very much, the early climbers were escorted to the mountains by soldiers who had often only recently pacified those mountains. And so there was this fantastic symbiosis between the two, whereby climbing was very much an activity of the elite. I mean, at Cambridge, everybody was a climber. Virginia Woolf's father, who founded the Alpine Club, everybody climbed. It was a gentleman's sport. And the climbers, in a way, elevated the soldiers, particularly someone like General Bruce, into the kind of the rarefied world of what climbing would become. And I think in the end, in looking back at all of these men, and it is a book that's dominated by men simply because that was the story, but we mustn't forget the women in that war. One thing as a writer, I certainly try to do is I always go back to this notion of show, don't tell. I never have any interest in telling someone what they should think or presenting masquerading a polemic with prose or something like that. You try to find that thing that makes you go, wow. I always sort of go, wow point. Like, if you want to, how was the war for the women? Well, you could give any amount of data, I guess, you want. But if you just remember that, Nancy Manners said, by the end of 1916, every boy I'd ever danced with was dead. Or Vera Brittain saying that, there was no one left to dance with. The extraordinary Vera Brittain, whose book Testament to Youth is without doubt the best memoir of that war. She lost her brother, her fiance, her two best friends. I mean, what a fantastic woman. But again, returning to the climbers, at the very end, I tried to think of why was I so captivated by these characters, and I think, a couple of things. They were men of another age, and these were men of discretion and decorum. They weren't prepared to litter the world with themselves. They had no sense of pop culture. They weren't men who were prepared to yield their feelings to analysis. And yet at the same time, they were men so confident in their masculinity that they could speak about love between men without shame. They could collect butterflies in the dawn for the British Museum. They could paint watercolors before lunch, and then over lunch discuss Keats and Shelley and Wordsworth and Shakespeare, and still be prepared to assault the German line by dusk, or indeed the flanks of Everest by morning. And they're a kind of character, a kind of man, I think, that I don't think we'll ever see again, for better or for worse, I suppose, in this opinion for some, but I think very much in a way for the better. And the most extraordinary thing to recall for anyone of us, born of that generation, these men were our grandfathers.
It is really interesting. I mean, the way in which you have just described the men, I want you to focus a little bit both on Mallory and Charles Bruce, that, so different in so many ways, but incredibly compelling characters. And that list of things that you say these men were doing routinely and not being embarrassed or ashamed of, the relationship between men and so on. Mallory was also, he had real difficulty with the Tibetans. I mean, he called it a hateful country inhabited by hateful people. And you can argue that it was just he was a person of his time, but it is an interesting dimension that I suppose is worth at least getting you to reflect on.
Well, that's a great comment because, oddly enough, I, fluctuated in my feelings about Mallory, and I have to say that by the end of the day, I admired him as an athlete, but for me, he was perhaps the least interesting of the 20 men who went to Everest, of the 26 men. He was very mercurial. He was uncertain of who he was. He wanted to be a writer, but he never was able to really make the grade. He really became part of the Bloomsbury set simply because everybody fell in love with him. Well, the question is, you just had to go to the British Library, and the only issue was what man in Britain hadn't tried to bed George Mallory. I mean, he had the only actual affair he had was with, Lytton's brother. But he was, Duncan Grant was enamored of him. I mean, Eddie Castle's Churchill's secretary was enamored of him. I mean, he had this kind of charismatic physicality that just drew men to him, a little bit like Rupert Brooke. And again, these were men operating in a different era, where terms like homosexuality had no meaning really. It was, these were men who were raised in homes by nannies who only connection to women had been with their sisters, who went off to these monastic schools, which were run by men who were products of those schools, as brutal as they could be. Places like Cambridge and Oxford were little apart from monastic. For example, you could not be head of a college at Cambridge in Mallory's time if you were married. I mean, the word effeminate in that time meant a man who spent too much time with his wife. And so, these men were products of that era. Mallory said those terrible things about Tibetan, but he also wrote to Ruth that he famously hated Canadians. And I don't know how you hate a Canadian, but he hated Canadians. And I never really figured that one out except a kind of colonial conceit. But I think Mallory was sort of adopting these kind of affectations of the British kind of contempt for other peoples, that kind of like a cloak, because when you read like Robert Graves writing about Mallory as a schoolmaster, a very different person comes across, a very sympathetic person. I think he was just a complex man. Don't forget, he was 38 years old when he died. He was still a young man. And General Bruce, my gosh, they called him the Mad Mountain Maniac. He was an absolute product of the Welsh coal districts. He was so strong he could lift two men up just by extending his arms on either side of his body. For exercise, he would put his adjutant on his back and run up and down the Khyber Pass. He famously could rip a pack of cards in half at he was thrown out of Harrow for having been thrashed more times in a shorter period of time than any student in the history of the school. And his final transgression was throwing a pot of geraniums off a high building, and it landed on some preachers. He was just such a character, and yet he was absolutely kind of that fat, British, but also incredibly courageous. At Gallipoli, machine gun fire literally severed his legs, and he was sent back to Britain to convalesce, and he was told whatever he was to do, he should never walk upstairs. And yet no one told him anything about not walking up Everest.
That really is, that kind of encompasses, just epitomizes the character part of what you're writing about. I'm wondering, you also once said that that Everest created the legend of Mallory and that Everest will always be Mallory. That is such an interesting idea, given that we know that the conquest then did come, 1953 and so on with Hillary. And I just wonder what you think now about what people think about when they think about Everest. You will always think about it through the lens of the research that you have so painstakingly done. But in the kind of popular imagination, do you think that is still true?
Well, I think that, the reason Mallory was heralded is, after all, he was the only one to go on all three expeditions, 21, 22, 24. There was something so poignant in the way that he disappeared. He was sighted by Odell, with young Sandy Irvine at his side, going strong for the top in the Northeast Ridge, when literally the mist rolled in and enveloped their memory and myth. And because, for so many years, his body had not been found, and to this day, Sandy's body has not been found, and there was so much speculation. And it's very interesting when Mallory's death was confirmed and accepted by the expedition, Colonel Norton immediately abandoned the mountain, and he used language that had been used in the war. It was a hard loss, but we had grown used to loss. And it was actually Beetham, I think, who wrote this beautiful passage that, as they left the valley, he's looking up at this sort of spectral mountain, and he says, somewhere up there, there are two men, yesterday in fine form, and now they are gone. And there's a critical line, without ever knowing the experience of decay. Who could ask for a better death? And that's a direct reference, at least, subconsciously, to the experience quite different on the Western Front, where, just think about this, we all wear poppies on Remembrance Day on November 11th, but few of us recall that the reasons poppies bloomed in Flanders fields is that the sheer amount of cordite and blood had transformed the chemistry of the soil. That's why poppies bloom in Flanders fields. So there was that, and then but Norton absolutely said, no communication, no speculation, let it be. But of course that wasn't going to happen. And back in London, long before the expedition had returned, people were already speculating. And it's interesting, the language was all kind of, Mallory must have made it. How could he not have made it? And there was this sort of feeling that kind of willed victory into uncertainty. And I think that's what sort of sowed the Mallory myth. And he was so handsome, good looking. He had such a beautiful wife and young kids. I think that's what sort of played into all of that. And the fascinating thing about Hillary is I was lucky enough to interview Sir Edmund Hillary, and I'm a good friend of his son, who's a wonderful fellow. And he was always so incredibly deferential to Mallory. If you remember, on top of the mountain, having himself refused to have his photograph taken, not out of principle, just because he couldn't be bothered by Tenzing. Instead, he's looking down that northeast ridge, wondering what came of Mallory, right? And when I asked him the direct question, he whether he ever felt that his achievement had been sort of overshadowed by the myth of Mallory, he just said to me very discreetly, "I think some part of mountaineering is getting down alive." And that's all he said about it, So what a beautiful man Sir Edmund Hillary was. I mean, geez, he was such a great person. And his triumph will never be forgotten, coming as it did on Coronation Day. I think the sadder question is what has become of Everest today. I mean, the commercialization of the mountain has become almost a caricature, and not simply because of people buying their way up, but it brings us around to the Tibetan message. Zatro Rinpoche famously, he didn't even break his meditation in 1921 to see the British, and in 22, when he did, he said simply in his Namtar, "It is so unfortunate that men will suffer so much for such a pointless aim." And this strikes to the core of the issue, is that from the British point of view, the hero is the one who gets to the top of Everest. For the Tibetan point of view, the hero is a bodhisattva, the individual who achieves enlightenment and escape from samsara, but elects to stay in this world to facilitate the transformation of the lives and destinies of others. And so from the Tibetan point of view, to climb into a zone of oxygen deprivation so severe that it obliterates consciousness and threatens death, and with death, the elimination of this extraordinary opportunity to achieve transformation, that's a fool's errand. I once was with a Lama in Tibet in a very different circumstance, and he said something really wonderful to me. He said, "We in Tibet don't believe that you went to the moon, but you did. You may not believe that we achieve enlightenment in one lifetime, but we do."
That's a fantastic note on which to end. Wade Davis, you are just the most remarkable storyteller. And for anyone who hasn't read this book, just listening to you will make them want to go and get immersed in this extraordinary book that you've written. Thank you so much for today, for your storytelling here on the podcast, but also thank you so much for your book.
Thank you very much.
We'd also like to thank the Blavatnik Family Foundation for its generous support of this podcast. To find out more about the Baillie Gifford Prize, you can visit our website or follow us on Twitter @BG Prize. And if this episode has piqued your interest, how could it have not, in the history of the prize, then you can find a 30-minute documentary on our website. Now, the winner of Winners Award is going to be announced on the 27th of April at an event held at the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh. In the meantime, do join me again to hear me talk to the other shortlisted authors about the impact of winning the Baillie Gifford Prize has had on their lives, a lot more about what they've written about that made them win, and so much more. Until then, thanks very much for being with us today. Bye-bye.
Read Smart, the Baillie Gifford Prize for Non-Fiction podcast. This podcast is generously supported by the Blavatnik Family Foundation.